In this episode of All About the Insight, we speak to Catherine Foote, Director at Phoenix Insights, about her experience in the insight industry and current role in understanding pensions and retirement saving behaviour. We hear about top tips for communicating insights effectively and the challenges of data quality and the ongoing need for clarity and storytelling to land insights. Please enjoy listening. Hi everybody and welcome to All About the Insights. Our guest today is Catherine Foote, Director at Phoenix Insights. Hello Catherine.
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you here. As you know, Catherine, this podcast is all about the insight, why it matters, how it can matter more, how we can improve business operations through insight. But let's start with you. Tell me, please, just a little bit about your journey to where you are today.
Great. Yeah, delighted to. So I work for a company called Phoenix Group, which is one of the UK's largest pensions and retirement savings companies. It's got lots of companies that you might have heard of within it, like Standard Life, for example, is probably the best known one. And I joined Phoenix 3 years ago now to set up a think tank. So rather than a traditional customer insight function, which Phoenix and its kind of sub companies already has, a think tank that would help it use research insight to speak to the outside world, to grow its brand and reputation as a purpose-driven business that has interesting and important things to say about what consumers and people are experiencing when it comes to saving for their pensions and journeying to and through retirement. And they brought me into the business to do that sort of research and insight work because that's my background. So I have a career in not-for-profit charities and think tanks doing the sorts of social research that has that kind of campaigning and political bent that seeks to use research insight to understand what's going on in the country and argue for decision makers to take different sorts of action to solve
Yeah,
problems for people.
yeah, yeah. Really important. The old pension. It seems a long way away, but a lot of people don't think about it. I suppose that's the point of it, and we need to think about it more.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've seen this really big transition in the UK away from old style final salary pensions, which you didn't really have to think about or engage in. As long as you were staying employed and you had a decent employer, chances were you were going to have a decent pension when you got to retirement. Life's more complicated now, and with defined contribution pensions, what you get is, a single pot towards your pension from every single employer you've
Mm.
worked with. So you end up with lots of little pots of money and also just a pot of money that you then have to work out what to do with rather than a guaranteed income for the rest of your life. You can turn it into a guaranteed income for the rest of your life. You can buy annuities with it. But life's much more complicated. So yeah, I think Phoenix wanted to use research and insight to raise awareness of some of these issues for people themselves and for the decision makers in the industry and in government that need to be really thinking about how can our pension system work better for future generations of retirees.
Definitely, definitely. So when you think around, and you mentioned, your kind of previous background, are there any particular highlights or particular experiences when you think back that you draw on today, that you make use of still today in your current role?
I suppose it's just a sort of steady career of increased understanding, I guess, and through experience of how research is received and used by the people that I'm trying to share it with.
Mm.
So I guess, experiences of meeting the sort of people who like a story, or the sort of people who like a picture, or the sort of people who like a kind of killer stat, a single number, and can kind of hold these different things in their head and respond to them differently. So I suppose no one specific experience, but I suppose a career that's taught me the different ways in which decision makers and senior people like to receive and react to research and insight information, and how you need to really understand those different preferences and needs and respond to them in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I remember when we spoke previously, I think you mentioned, kind of distilling a great big report into four bubbles or whatever. So it'll be something to pick up on in a little bit, just to
Yeah.
understand how we can really communicate that impact. In terms of, kind of staying in the insight industry the research and insight industry across your career and kind of your current motivations, why stay in insights? What is it that does it for you? Is there a particular thing about insights that interests you?
Gosh, I don't know. I feel like I'm going to be lying down on the psychiatrist's couch now. I don't know. What is it? Why do I do what I do? I don't know, Alex. Why do any of us do
It's
what we
not an
do?
existential question, don't worry.
Yeah. No, no, no. I think, I suppose I'd say, I'm just sort of eternally curious, I suppose. I think there are, any piece of work creates as many questions as it does answers about what's really going on or why um, a person or a group of people are feeling that way or experiencing a service in that way. Um, and I really enjoy following my nose, answering the next question, and trying to answer the next question and the next question. And I suppose that's always been a really important part of how I enjoy my day and my week and my year and what I get out of work. I also really enjoy um, sort of and using research to bring clarity to complex situations. So I think I also get a big kick out of being able to communicate, complex life experiences, diverse, different consumer journeys through a particular service, particular industry, particular bit of public policy too, in ways that people can remember, in ways that land, that still feel true to the complexity of that real situation, um, but in ways that genuinely give people that kind of light bulb moment. And I love that feeling of when you see an audience in a room, if you're giving a presentation or speaking at a round table of decision makers, when you get those nods or you get those oh okay, or you begin to get your sort of summary of a situation said back to you, weeks, months later, and you realise, okay, yeah, that's really helped
Yeah,
people
it's landed.
understand that
Yeah,
situation. That feels great.
brilliant. And in terms of Phoenix and the kind of current inside setup scenario, just tell me a little bit about that in terms of kind of what's going on, the typical challenges or insight needs that you are asked to look at.
Yes, so as I said, we're different to the team in the company that do your sort of classic customer insight and market research. So instead, we tend to use as our sort of sources of evidence national statistics, big national surveys, government data sets, administrative data, and we do some of our own surveys, polling, interviews, all of those sort of classic methodologies. And we're really trying to understand not just for Phoenix's customers and their interactions with the customer, with the company, but more broadly, what is going on for different types of people in Britain when they think about how long they're going to work for, how they're going to approach retirement, how they think about saving their pension and their retirement income. So lots of different suppliers then come into the mix for us. So we work with all sorts of different people, university departments, big market research companies, smaller sort of boutique organizations that do, for example, particular methods like deliberative work with the public, where you're bringing a group of the public in a room together for a length of time to sort of debate an issue. So building up, I guess, a kind of network of really trusted suppliers has been really important for us to do that work, and having the right sort of expertise in-house to be really aware about what sort of national and administrative data exists
Mm.
in Britain. What are the trusted surveys? How do you get access to that data? What can you analyse? What can't you analyse? And those sorts of networks with academic departments in particular to help us make the most of what already exists.
And do you, you mentioned you were slightly separate to the consumer research and insight team in the kind of traditional sense. Is there interaction there? Do you play off
Yeah,
each other? Do you work together? How does that work?
yeah, absolutely, we do. Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. So, no, there are. they've got, I think, at two levels really, both in terms of the content of what we're working on and what questions the business might have and issues that we might want to be exploring, and similarities and differences in what we're finding in the broader UK population versus the company's sort of customer population, but also just in terms of skills and expertise. So
Mm.
able to sort of quality assure each other's work, debate what particular finding might mean, think about how to phrase questions in surveys, that sort of
Mm.
thing. So yeah, they're a great team to collaborate with.
Brilliant, brilliant. And in terms of the typical, well, tell me, is there a typical kind of research question, research need, or is it just so varied?
I mean, it all speaks to the broad purpose of what the think tank has been set up to do, which is to
Mhm.
um, drive drive the company's ability to be a kind of system leader. So it's to give it understanding and things to say about where the pension system is working and not working for people, and what therefore needs to change. That's the sort of fundamental overarching question. Help us understand what's working, what's not working, and what we might want to
Okay.
be trying to influence in the system, influence in public policy to make a
Yeah.
difference.
So the natural lead on from that is in terms of your work, your kind of peer team's work. How do you know when insights are working? You know, what does that look and feel like for the business?
Yeah. Um, I suppose it definitely feels like everybody's borrowing your slides at the start of all of their presentations, so across the business. I know I'm having impact inside the business when all of the leaders of our sort of more commercial business units frame the product they're launching, or the initiative that they're the bit of proposition that they're developing, or whatever it is they're working on, in the context of the social trends data that I've given them. It's a sort of really critical scene setting piece for them to help them explain why what they're doing is valuable and important and is going to make a difference for people. So I think it's working when that's happening, you know when our CEO starts his speeches in that way, with some of those sorts of, some of those particular sorts of data points, or is quoting us when he's having a sort of long form interview with a finance journalist in the papers,
Mm.
or whatever. And I think, um, I have to admit, I'm also a sucker for when people come back with more questions. So when we've done some work with colleagues in the business, we've shared some of what we're going to do. We've had lively workshops and discussions internally about what I call the so what, the sort of, okay, so what does this mean for the business? What are the implications of this? When people, perhaps more reflective personalities, go away from that session and then come back a day, a week, 2 weeks later, and say, oh, I was really, that stuck with me, that thing, and I want to ask you a bit more about it. That's when when you've got that kind of like insight earworm inside somebody's brain, isn't it?
Brilliant.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
they're really thinking about it.
The Insight Earworm. We should have called the podcast that. So, might have had to pay royalties, but it's fine. Um, really interested you talk around the so what question there, and I think that's an ongoing kind of classic question when you're working either with your team, with yourself, or with your stakeholders. Are there any tips, tactics, strategies that help you uncover that and unpick that so what question? Because that's a really important thing, obviously, in terms of, you can do a survey, a focus group, whatever it is, but it's that next step. And just interested to know, as I say, if there's any tips or strategies or tactics to really get to the nub of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably my principal one is right at the start of any work, when we're in discussions about wanting to, let's say, do a new survey. Let's say ask a set of questions to some people. Um, Really understanding why we want to ask those questions. To what end? What are we going to do with that information before we even start? Because I'm as guilty as anyone at thinking, well, this would be a bunch of super interesting questions. this would be undoubtedly really interesting, and we don't know the answer to those questions. So let's find out. When you have to actually ask yourself and your colleagues in the business, well, it might be interesting, but what are you going to do with it? What's it for? To really dig into making sure you understand why you're choosing the questions that you're choosing. I think we've probably all had experiences, particularly in running surveys, where you inevitably end up padding them out with all sorts of stuff that you end up not using. It all feels logical and it all feels interesting. You think, well, I've got 20 minutes and let's ask all these things, and that flows on from that. And then 6 months later, you realize, God, I only actually materially used about a third of that, consistently long
Yeah.
term. Only about a third of that was useful. And of course, there's going to be some kind of natural percentage. Is never going to be 100%, is it? You're never going to get this stuff perfectly, but I guess that's the key, is trying to really challenge yourselves and your colleagues, to not just think that'll be fun, that's a nice question to ask, that'd be interesting, but to really ask why. What are you going to do with the answer?
Yeah, yeah. Well, what is the purpose of this question? Almost being
Yeah.
very literal with each one. You also mentioned different data sets as well, and I know obviously you're working in a slightly different field to me, from a kind of public policy almost side of things. I'm also in a more commercial world. One thing that people in my world are often faced with and asked around is kind of broader trends and patterns in society. Just in terms of any data sets, surveys that are available out there, are there any that you can think of that are available for that people can get their hands on? Or
Oh, well, I love the census. I think, it's only every 10 years, but it's an incredibly rich data set that gives you a really um, complex picture. So I'm on the ONS website a lot. So the census is great. For me in my industry, financial services, something like the National Wealth and Assets Survey is a really lovely, again, really, really rich data set. I also love the birth cohort studies, the sort of longitudinal data sets where you're
okay,
tracking a birth year or a cohort of people through life. They're
yeah,
extraordinary, those. They're an extraordinary gift to sort of UK evidence and data in public policy. There's different people will be interested in different ones. They've just got funding to do a new one for, if you like, the pandemic babies, and what's
okay,
going to happen to
yeah,
them for the rest of their lives. They had the most recent one was the millennium babies, so babies just born around the millennium. I do a lot of work with a 1946 birth cohort study. So those are people who are just now in sort of ending the first phase of their retirement, if you like. They're in their sort of mid to late 70s. There's also another great one for me, birth cohort in 58, and you're getting people's whole lives, because so often with data it's just cross-sectional, isn't it? It's just a moment in time,
yeah,
and you're not really seeing things change over time specifically for a group of people. So I think longitudinal studies are
yeah.
a wealth of, you just get to ask a very different set of questions. You get answers to very different sorts of questions that cross-sectional data doesn't get you. So those are some of my favorites.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. So when you think around insights and, kind of back on your career and currently, can you think of any occasions, examples, kind of highlights of when insights have really made a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I say, I think we were talking about, the importance of insight as a kind of the conversation starter, if you like, or the scene setter for a for a conversation. So I think, when we've done work, for example, I've worked for a long time on issues of the length of working life and how long are people going to be able to stay in employment for. We have a system that has access now to the state pension at 66, but actually only about a third of people are still in work at that point. An awful lot of people have fallen out, some because they can afford to, and good luck to them, but lots for whom they've just found, they've found themselves unfortunately redundant. And the older you get, the closer you get to retirement, the harder it is to get back into the labour market. And so some of the work, that I've done in that space, where you just find something that slightly perhaps challenges an assumption. So to give you an example, there's a lot of talk, and it's an incredibly important issue, about child poverty at the moment, about how, about a quarter of children in the UK at the moment are in some level of of poverty and food poverty. It's horrific, isn't it? But through the work I was doing, I was able to show that for the adult population, the age group that has seen the greatest increase in poverty over the last 15 years is the age group 60 to 65. So just that pre-retirement period. And I found an incredibly useful insight because it challenged some assumptions about rich people in there. The older you get, the richer you are. The kind of okay boomer, we don't need to worry about older people. They've got it golden. It's younger generations that we need to worry about. And help me really make that case that if you've got bad luck and you're out of work by the time you're 60, the risk then if you're on a sort of low, if you were on a kind of low middle income before, the risk that you dip into poverty for those last few years while you're waiting for your access to the state pension is really real and material. So I suppose that would be an example of when I found, data and insight can maybe bust a myth or challenge an assumption, and can really, if you like, just sort of reframe a debate a little bit, just reset a conversation that you're trying to have with people.
Yeah. That I was chatting with somebody else the other day, and they spoke around, kind of myth busting, and kind of not taking things for not granted, but not necessarily accepting the status quo and being brave enough to say, this is what people think, but actually this is what the data's saying. So
yeah,
really fascinating. We spoke earlier around, kind of research comms very briefly, and I don't know whether you'd use the same example, but when you are trying to embed that myth-busting insight or really land a piece of insight, what tips, tricks would you use to do that? How can you really effectively land insight in a business?
Well, I mean, I've learned everything's in the preparation, I guess. And so a really important team to collaborate with, if that's your intention, right from the start, is your PR and press team. So really important. There's no point me spending money on doing some lovely deep work if I've got an objective to get it in the papers, and I haven't spoken to the experts about how do you get things in the papers and what a journalist interested in, at the moment. So I think talking to the people that are expert in the audiences you're trying to reach, and really thoughtfully thinking about what would land with them, what's timely with them, and not just the content but the method of delivery. Is it typically we're to get things in the papers, numbers are the way to go, but if you're actually trying to land something sort of longer term and more fundamental, amongst a group of decision makers, sometimes some qualitative insights, some stories, some vox pops, some video can be incredibly impactful. The classic thing of you bring the voice of real people into a room of professionals, and that's the bit they remember. That's the bit they remember from the day because it suddenly felt real and it connected them to why they're doing what they're doing, and what actually matters to them in the job, rather than just being in the kind of in the sort of professional to professional environment. So I think it just really depends what you're trying to do, but who you're trying to influence and what your route to that is, and being then very thoughtful about both the content of what you're producing and the methods that you use to disseminate it.
Yeah, I mean, from a qualitative perspective, that's my predominant background. As you say, the kind of voice of the consumer and hearing them from, be it an edited video clip or whatever it is, but actually having that in a presentation is more powerful than me saying and trying to repeat it. It's
absolutely. One of the things that in my company goes down incredibly well is when you listen to customer calls. I was in one session recently where they did do some. I can't remember whether they kind of recreated it with actors or whether it was really literally a recording of the call. I'm not sure, but there was actually something really interesting about that because it was there was no image, so it was a kind of voice in the room, and so it's that different power of, it's about like listening to a podcast or a bit of radio or something that gives you a different sort of different feeling, doesn't it? And takes your head into a different place when you're not being given the image as well as the sound. It worked really well.
Yeah, interesting. But I suppose it makes you maybe focus on the words a bit more, the ideas, the themes.
Exactly, the tone of voice, the sort of, exactly. Yeah.
Just one final question on kind of research comms and whatever in terms of reports and decks and the like, any good ideas there in terms of things that you've seen succeed in the past to help land insights?
Oh, I mean, just, take it as far as you can and as simple as you think you can make it, and then make it about twice as simple, you know? I think that's the thing. Really challenge yourself to not overload with all of the complexity and the interpretation and the nuance, and make it straightforward to grasp, particularly visually, um, you know, what you're trying to say. Sometimes, and there are skills there, and you've got to find the people with those skills.
Mm,
But those skills in sort of data visualization, or even just simply like, what's the right chart to choose here, and what's the right way to display it? Um, if you're not working with people with those skills, you can get some very important information totally lost in very dry looking
mm, mm.
looking material. But I think I think people are increasingly skilling themselves up in some of this stuff about how do you really land that point, and how do you really make that arresting and easy to see the
Yeah,
data. And yeah, I think I love working with people that are creative about that and really thoughtful about that.
yeah. Uh, it's a skill to have, isn't it? So
Yeah.
we can do the research, we can do the insights, and then if somebody can, if we can effectively communicate that to our colleague, they can make it look pretty or particularly impactful.
Yeah.
We've heard, kind of how you've had success with insights. Obviously, in a lot of businesses, there can be challenges to insights for different reasons. How and I suppose what challenges might you have seen over your career in terms of insights as a whole, and how might you overcome them? How do you kind of turn those negative ideas and opinions around insight into something positive?
I mean, I suppose I wouldn't say I've experienced a lot of negative opinion, but I mean, I've been working now for, I don't know, coming on for over 20 years now. And so, yeah, so I started working, yeah, basically 25 years now, blimey. Um, so I started work still in like the early days of the internet, really, and
Mm,
pre social media. So I suppose the biggest thing I've seen is a complete transformation, if you like, of the level of competition in the information environment for everybody. You
hmm
know, you cannot underestimate how bombarded we all are with people trying to share their insight and share. I mean, a lot of it is sort of share their kind of their hot take, share their opinion,
mm,
but in the insight world too. And so I guess it just means you know, there was a time when I could have expected more people to read all 20 pages of something.
mm,
And
mm,
I would never expect that anymore. It was probably never true. I was probably naive back then too. Um, but I think it's even harder to do that. I have a friend who recently got elected to Parliament. She became an MP
hmm
in this most recent general election, and she was sharing with me like the amount of stuff she gets every day from campaigning organisations,
Yeah, yeah.
advocacy
Oh, I can imagine.
organisations.
Yeah.
These great wadges of stuff. So I suppose that's the challenge: is in an incredibly competitive, if you like, information environment, in a complete sort of waterfall of content and material that we're all standing underneath all day long in our jobs. Um, how do you how do you get your message? How do you get your message across? Yeah, and I suppose part of that is really recognizing the power of timing. So just because you've done a bit of work doesn't mean that when it's done is the right time to tell people about it. You might want to
Okay.
tell people about it when it's done,
Mm,
and it might be needed when it's done. But I found myself going back to work weeks, months, even years later, and suddenly then the window's open, the opportunity is there,
okay. Yeah.
um, because the environment's changed, people's priorities have changed, something's having a bit of a moment, an issue's having a bit of a moment. You don't know, because of course my work is all about trying to sort of influence this external environment. So I suppose never, um, yeah, how to cut through, I guess, and never, never miss an opportunity to go back to something you did in the past that you think might have another shot at having a useful life.
And in terms of that cutting through, does that go back to what you're saying around data viz and whatever? Is that where we're cutting through, or?
I think that's really important. Yeah, absolutely. And I think storytelling though too. So how do you piece a story together from what you've done? I think that's so critical. I see so much stuff that's here's a point, here's a thing, and then here's another thing that's related, and then here's another related thing, and then here's 10 more other related things, and there's some sort of attempt at a conclusion that brings it all together. Um, Whereas if you worked a little bit harder, you could craft a narrative, a story for that data that would be much more compelling. So it's not just in the sort of single images either. I think story is important.
And that does beg the question. I mean, it's a very nebulous and possibly impossible question to answer, but how do you craft a story? Any tips, ideas there?
It's just about spending the time, isn't it? I think we're all under an awful lot of pressure to get on to the next thing, do the next thing. It's done, it's out, here's the data, off we go, here it is summarized. Not my problem whether or not you pay attention to it or not. But if you choose to make it your problem, and if you choose to really think about um, how can I reach this audience in the most compelling way, then you naturally do get into that mindset. And I think the more time also that you spend, the more human time you spend with the people that you're trying to influence to really understand how they think and how they receive information and how they how they would view this data, how this data would sort of fit into their kind of map of the world and way of thinking
Mm.
about the world, the more likely you are to be able to craft a story that resonates.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, that makes sense in terms of kind of immersing both in participants and stakeholders, understanding where that story is. We've heard a lot about your varied and interesting career and important career. When you look forward, do you see any changes, challenges for the insights industry in the next 2, 5, 10 years?
There are some big challenges in some of the national data. So people don't answer surveys like they used to. Um, not some of our sort of government surveys have got
Mm.
some real challenges at the moment. So I think there are some kind of data quality issues. I think definitely. Um, and I mean, if you'll forgive me, sort of, I guess being a little bit sort of self-critical, but there's a lot of repetition. There's too much. There is
Mm.
too many people asking the same sorts of questions to a
Mhm.
slightly different, every company doing, here's 1,500 people and it's and this is the answer to the universe from 1,500 people, um, surveyed last week. Um, it Without real proper attention to sampling, without real thought about getting enough in there to be able to have something meaningful to say about people from different ethnic backgrounds, let's say, or people from different geographies in the country.
Mhm.
So I think there's an awful lot of cheap stuff out
Okay.
there
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is oversold and that does not help the case of
yeah,
uh, this is this is this is some data that we can have some confidence in represents some sort of truth about the world, because I think
yeah,
there's a lot of stuff that I certainly wouldn't be proud to stand behind and represent, but it's cheap and it feels sort of doable and you can turn it around and people can use it in marketing and all this sort of stuff. So if there's a risk, it's just that this is an industry to some extent that creates its own problem with all sorts of the too much low quality
yeah.
data.
And is that the waterfall of content that you kind of mentioned earlier as well?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It intrigued, you mentioned people don't answer surveys like they used to. In what ways do they not answer surveys like they used to?
Well, so we really, truly don't have a lot of confidence in our employment statistics in the UK at the moment. We don't.
Okay.
We're not really sure who's got a job and what job they've got. Our National Labour Force survey participation switched in the last few years to an online only form that has then seen some really biased sampling,
Mhm.
some real struggles to get genuine participation from people in all different labour market situations. So we're just not really very confident in that
Okay.
data at the moment. That survey is I think, a particular problem. So I would say it's this question of, it's a perennial question, but in an environment where you have got more and more people living precarious lives, with, complex and sometimes chaotic situations, difficulties with their health and with their mental health, it becomes ever harder to be really certain that you are genuinely
Okay.
speaking to everybody and hearing from everybody.
And the solution to that is, I'm not going to try and guess it. I'm going to put that back on you. How do we solve that?
Well, it becomes more,
How do we improve data quality? That's a
yeah, it
very
becomes more expensive, I suppose, doesn't it? And you need to be working with people and finding companies and suppliers to do your work that really understand how are they going to reach. I hate the phrase, but that, the hard to reach. How are they going to reach the hard to hear from?
yeah,
How are you going to be, if it's important to the work that you're doing? Of course, if you're sampling, I don't know, wealthy customers about their sort of investment choices or whatever, and
yeah,
then less relevant, you're fine. You don't need to worry about it. But if you're trying to be sort of population representative, or you are even sort of specifically trying to reach people on low incomes, or in my world, in sort of some level of financial hardship, then it's just making sure that you're really reassuring yourselves that the right methods are being used, and the appropriate amount of money is being spent to make sure that happens.
brilliant, brilliant. We've heard some great tips, ideas there. Thank you very much, Catherine. This podcast is all about the insights. So, as you think back on your career, everything we've discussed, everything that you discussed with your colleagues and whatever, is there one tip that you would give to a business, an organisation, to other researchers around how to make insights matter more?
I think it's that question. Always ask yourself, what are you going to do with the answer? Make sure that you've asked yourself that question, and don't just say, we'll share it with our stakeholders because that will be interesting content for them. Ask yourself a harder question about how it will really materially be meaningful to your business's strategy.
Perfect. Catherine, thank you so much for that. I've had fun. I hope you have too. Really interesting
That was
chat.
great. Yeah, lovely to meet you, Alex.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
All the best. Bye bye.